Gustin. I'm the public program manager for the Vermont Historical Society, where for the last number of years we've been engaged in a project to learn more about, to collect information on the counterculture movements, specifically in Vermont of sort of the late 1960s into the 1970s. I'm going to give you sort of an overview of how we went about this project, the kinds of things we learned. I'll do a little bit more of a focus on sustainable living and agricultural practices, which is a major part of this movement, but also very much reflects on the Nearings philosophy and their influence on this movement. But it was a vast project for which we generated quite a lot of information, and then eventually an exhibition. And there are 2 postcards on the small table with the TV over there, and if you're curious about either the exhibition or the digital resources that we are putting up that we created as part of this project, you're welcome to take those with you and to learn more to your heart's content. So the Vermont Historical Society is based in Barre, Montpelier. Our mission is to collect, share, and document the history of the entire state of Vermont. And our recently retired curator, Jackie Calder, had been working for probably about the last 8 to 10 years, sort of nibbling away at the corners of some kind of big project, looking at how Vermont changed in the 1970s, that started doing a small exhibit on food co-ops. Awful lot of them are founded in the 1970s, and then we were able to do a small photography and oral history exhibit on the earliest organic farmers in Vermont, and awful lot of them got their start in the 1970s as well. We put together a sort of annual day-long conference, and putting all those things together, we applied for grant funding to spend a couple of years collecting oral histories, collecting objects, collecting archival pieces, like letters, diaries, photographs, pamphlets, books, and things like that, do an exhibition, and then do a major symposium looking at counterculture and its influence on the state of Vermont specifically, but sort of more broadly, how those themes of going back to the land, of political activism, of a growing awareness of social justice, how those sort of influenced broader culture, and how they resulted in to some extent, a lot of northern New England culture that we think of today. So, counterculture. This is what a lot of people have in their heads when we talk about counterculture in the 1970s. This is a photograph from the Goddard College yearbook from 1971. This is, to be fair, this is a photograph taken of a group of students who'd chosen to live in sort of a sustainable, back to the land portion of the Goddard College campus. So this is even more counterculture than the Goddard campus was averagely. But it's a photograph that does a really interesting job sum up what a lot of people think of when they think of counterculture, and specifically the 1970s, 60s, and 70s in Vermont. It may help while we're looking at this photograph to give you just a little bit of the background on the state of Vermont before we get to what it ends up being, in that Vermont is like sort of the interior of Maine, a profoundly rural state with a low population. It is a state that had been aging and whose population had been stagnant or decreasing for most of its history. More or less since the early 19th century, Vermont's population had remained stable or even declined to a certain degree. It's a state in which that agricultural history was fading throughout the 20th century. Technological upgrades to things like dairy farms with the introduction of the bulk tank and other agricultural practices had made it more and more difficult for small farmers to sort of keep up with changes and to keep up with the way farming was going. The influx of people buying second properties, which began in Vermont in sort of the 19-teens, the 1920s, started to drive up property taxes and meant that smaller family farms were not as sustainable as they were. So in Vermont, you have a state where the breadth of agriculture is slowly declining, and that a lot of those old family farms, the next generation is not interested in carrying them on or not able to carry them on, are starting to go up for sale. A lot of that farmland is reverting back to untilled land or even wilderness in a lot of the places by about the middle of the century. It's also a state that was like Maine, one of the most solid red Republican reliable states from 1860 to about 1960. It was a deeply, deeply Republican place. With the party shift of the 1960s and internal changes in Vermont as well, all of this is going to start to change in the 1960s. Vermont is going to elect its first ever Democrat to statewide office, Governor Phil Hoff, in the early 1960s, and a shift in reapportionment of the legislature means that instead of one representative from each town, it's now going to be representatives who represent a chunk of the population, which is going to give weight to places like Chittenden County, which is the most populous and most urban county in Vermont, and is going to start to swing that to the sort of more liberal end of the spectrum. Why is that all important? Because if you had said to someone 30 years before, or even in the 1950s, that Vermont would be the place we think of now as the home of Bernie Sanders, they would have been horrified and deeply confused. Because that was not at all the place that Vermont was. There had been back-to-land experiments in Vermont throughout the 19th century, and then, of course, the Nearings being among the leaders of a back-to-the-land movement from the late 1920s into sort of the early 1940s. But it was a very different character of a movement than what we're about to see happen. However, Vermont, like the rest of the country, is going to start to change in the 1960s with that change in apportionment of its legislature and also its population. Vermont's population grew 15% in the 1960s and then 14% in the 1970s, the biggest population jumps since the Revolutionary War. Half of the population jump in the 1970s is going to be people from out of state. So you get a lot of people coming into the state all of a sudden. It's not just baby boomers sort of coming of age, and that's going to start to, I don't necessarily think of it as that is the big sweeping change, but it's a movement that's going to accelerate changes that are already occurring and is going to shape the way it goes going forward. So, hence this photograph of Goddard College. So when we set out to do this project, you probably can't read this, but I will read off. All you have to see are the graphs. We basically started off trying to figure out, like, what does this mean, counterculture? We have this general sense that counterculture of the 60s and 70s was fueled by a couple of different things, and that it led them down from the state. So we asked people, did you consider yourself part of the counterculture movement at the time, and in what areas? And we provided these options for people, because this is at the very beginning of our project, and we weren't 100% sure what would happen. We said politics, community organizing, protest movements, social reform, food and sustainable living, environmental and conservation advocacy, arts, crafts, and music, quote, just dropping out. Or the last option, I did not consider myself part of the counterculture. This is a survey of which about 1,000 people answered. Almost 30% said they did not consider themselves part of the counterculture, which was, and these are people who are self-identifying. I'd like to take a survey about my time in the 1970s, which was sort of an early indicator to us that this was a far more complex topic, and we were not going to spend the next couple of years just visiting communes, which we did anyway. But when we thought about the breadth of what was going on, one of our board members said something to me around the time we were doing the surveys that summed it up. She said, you know, I feel like, her husband was a professor at UVM, she said, I feel like the 70s, like, I don't really remember them because I was raising kids, and my husband was up for tenure, and we just bought a house, and I didn't have anything to do with any of that. She said, and then you started this project, and I thought, you know, I got really into baking my own bread, and I discovered brown rice, and then I started, like, going to the local food distribution buying cooperative and getting my brown rice from them instead of just buying it in New York City when we were visiting down there. And all of these little things that had percolated out from a core central counterculture that we're talking about made broader influences. And to a large extent, that's what we're talking about today. So even people who would not have identified as counterculture, I often give my parents as an example, who are okay with being called like the squarest people on the face of the earth. My dad still owns pocket protectors. He's a proud engineer. But they bought a cider press from Plainfield, Vermont in the early 1970s. Even they were sort of on the edges of this and interested in this. So it's a broad-based movement. And what do I mean by that? In the 1960s in America, there is broad political, cultural, social unrest. The responses to that are going to be varied. Protests to what's going on, chief among them the Vietnam War, But also, so it's going to spark an initial wave of protest and profound involvement. By the end of the decade, by the end of the 1960s, a significant amount of that political energy and activism is going to be focused on sort of dropping out and going back to the land. Not all of it, but a significant portion of it. And Vermont becomes a place where people go to leave the city behind. They're trying to remake a society in a better image. Again, all of this is reflecting societal impulses that have happened before. We were talking earlier, it seems to happen every 40 years. This is a redux of some of those back to the land feelings in the 1920s and 30s, reignited by protests against the Vietnam War. Your first really big public spark of this in Vermont is what's being portrayed in this photograph, which is the UVM campus the day after the Kent State shootings in May of 1970. This is really a spark that goes across Vermont and reaches the colleges and the universities first. So this is UVM, but there were strikes, teach-ins, protests at nearly every college and university in the entire state. Middlebury College shut down for a week. Others had demonstrations and things like that. There was so much concern because, as you can see, the protest at UVM was huge. There was so much concern that this was going to become a sort of Kent State-like problem at Vermont that the then 30-year-old state's attorney for Chittenden County, a young man named Patrick Leahy, was corresponding with the governor, really worried they would have to call out the National Guard. They did not. The protests continued for about a week, 2 weeks, and were peaceful. But this is the first spark, the first indication that things are going to reach peaceful Vermont, that things are going on that match the national tenor. Vermont had already been involved in anti-Vietnam protests, but this is really going to up the game. This is from the UVM campus. This is a poster that was put up around the UVM campus, encouraging people to go down to Washington, D.C. to march against Vietnam. And this is a group of people from a commune that was near UVM at the time. The gentleman on the left is actually a UVM professor. I've spent probably the first 6 months of this project looking at this photograph before I realized they're in the middle of the street. They've dragged those park benches into the middle of the street in Washington, D.C. They're down there to protest. So anti-Vietnam is going to be the first big push that leads to people in Vermont organizing, protesting, etc. in the summer of 1970. We're going to fast forward to the summer of 1971, in which the spring of 1970, there was an article published in a law review book at law review out of Yale University. It's not the Yale Law Review, but a different one, called Jamestown 1970. A couple of law students of a slightly more radical bent theorized that if you put enough people together, say 50,000, and you went to a rural place with a low population, you could, in essence, take over, quote unquote, take over that place. If you made everyone go to different communities and vote, and you got a politically active, cohesive group of people. This is just pure, like, imaginary thinking, but in a footnote, they named, there are a couple of states where this actually might work today. One of the states they named was Vermont. A state representative from Plainfield, who was a very conservative person, is a very conservative representative, hears about this through one of his aides, completely panics, because he is representing the town where Goddard College is, and they're talking about lowering the voting age to 18 at the time. He's pretty convinced he's going to get voted out of office, that all the Goddard College, which is the center of counterculture, kids are going to kick him out of office. He holds a whole hearing, and from that hearing comes this article in Playboy magazine called Taking Over Vermont, as well as a slew of letters to the governor's office, because people become convinced that 50,000 hippies are coming to Vermont in the summer of 1971 to, quote, take over the state. Remember, this is a state that's rural, that's generally conservative, that's deeply agricultural, and these, quote unquote, people are imagined to bring with them the ideas of the counterculture, which mean counter everything that they currently believe is the best way to live. They're experimenting with sexual mores, sort of taking apart the nuclear family and changing that up. They're going against the dominant ways of eating at the time, growing food and eating at the time, against sort of factory farms, big ag, not processed food, but the beginnings of what we would think of today as the farm-to-table movement. These are the very early seeds of the women's rights movement and the gay rights movement. The idea that you shouldn't always do exactly what your parents have done and listen to them when they tell you that they know best, and a youth culture driven by sort of the baby boom coming of age during this time. So the idea that this is going to sweep and take over Vermont becomes a sort of panic in the summer of 1971. I'm going to read this caption because it's amazing, and it sort of sums up what people were afraid of, or caricatured as the hippie of the time. And it says, "I'll run over and pick up my unemployment check and then drop off at the university to see what's holding up my federal education check and look into my research grant check. You go to the free VD clinic and check on your tests, then go to the free health clinic and pick up my glasses. I'll pick up the food stamps, hit the drug rehab office, and we'll meet at the federal building at noon for the mass picketing of the stinking establishment." This political cartoon was in the governor's papers in the Vermont State Archives. It was included in a whole folder about his planned response to these 50,000 hippies coming to Vermont in 1971. People were writing him letters saying, "You've got to stop this. You've got to. This is definitely going to happen, and it's going to ruin everything. Please do something." To which he was forced to issue a public statement saying, essentially, "We can't do anything, and we're not going to do anything. First of all, this is not a real thing. Second of all, yes, we are getting a lot of people coming to Vermont. Something on the order of by the numbers later we see, something on the order of 50,000 new people in the state of Vermont at the time, but the percentage of those involved with the counterculture is tiny." He says, "Just calm down. It's all going to work out." That doesn't stop places from starting to worry, because by the mid to late 60s, people had started to come to Vermont to buy up this agricultural land that was going fallow, going inexpensively, or at least from the perspective of people coming up from New York City and from Boston, and starting to form communities based around a number of different organizing ideals, and we'll talk about that in a minute. This is the St. Albans Messenger, a newspaper from the northern part of Vermont, hippie communes in 6 towns. These people were going into more rural areas. And so there were communes starting to be founded around back to the land principles, organizing principles of getting away from it all, escaping the big city, finding a new way of living. So this is a community in southern Vermont. And some of the things that people were afraid of, the Vermonters were afraid of, coming with 50,000 hippies, did happen. Some of these communities were loosely organized. There was quite a lot of illegal drug use. They absolutely were experimenting sexually. They absolutely were sort of rejecting a lot of what had been held as the gold standard and the only way to organize or live a society. On the side of the building here it says, "No illegal drugs, no more pets, no soap in the stream, no picnickers, visitors welcome, no minors overnight without parental permission," and on the bottom, "Use the trench." Those are the only rules for this community. There were, depending on the community, there were as many as 500 to 1,000 people in one summer, and then it would get quite a bit smaller during the winter. Some of them were minors, were kids running away from home. There were sometimes sort of lax cleanliness standards at some of them, so this is sort of among the fears that people, at this particular one, there was a fire that killed a number of people, and it was so far up in the hills of southern Vermont that the fire trucks couldn't get there in time. The roads were so bad. So they were sort of breaking apart some of the social structures that had held together small communities in Vermont, sometimes purposefully and sometimes unintentionally. This is another one called Earth People's Park in Norton, right on the Canadian border in the north of Vermont. The Hog Farm, which was a commune in California at the time, was nationally known because it was led by, among other things, Wavy Gravy, who was an activist at the time. They purchased this land in the north of Vermont, and they said, "Free land. That's it. Just come." live on this free land, do whatever you want, which led to a lot. Some people arrived with literally only the clothes on their backs and not a lot of understanding of what it would take to live through a Vermont winter, or any intention necessarily of living together as a tight-knit community, or of sort of living productively and according to a plan. They were just trying to escape and trying to get out. So you see these people in t-shirts and jeans in the winter. It got a very bad reputation in town because there was just nothing. There were no permanent structures on this land. Norton, Vermont is tiny, tiny. They put people from associated with this community put so many collect calls on the local payphone that it got taken out, and for a lot of residents that was the only phone because they were not sending phone lines to the middle of nowhere in Vermont at that time. And it had just a really, really bad reputation. The people at this community at various times outnumbered the people in the town. So this was sort of the bad side of the story. But they were driven by something that drove a lot of the back to the land movement of the 1970s. And communes and people living on communes are the minority here. Most people who are coming to Vermont this time, who are trying to drop out, trying to live a simpler life, they are not necessarily living on communes. They may be coming to buy their own land and live a small, sustainable lifestyle. They may be coming up for a job in Vermont, but they're looking for something in Vermont. And they cite a lot of influences. And in fact, Living the Good Life is one of the main ones that people cite, and it has a reprinting in the 1970s because of a resurgence of interest in it. People are finding the book at their local libraries and thinking they went to Vermont. They were in Vermont living this life. I can live this life too. This is my inspiration. And it had such interest that there was that reprinting in the 70s. People picked up the Mother Earth News, which starts publishing at this time. They started receiving the Whole Earth Catalog. Garden Way starts as a publishing venture to teach people how to live the nitty-gritty of achieving this lifestyle. And they're all looking to do something that I think this pamphlet, which is for Earth People's Park, but it sums it up: create America in Vermont. There's a sense of optimism and of hope here. They're trying to fix America, to undo the things that have been broken, to restore what they think of. It's a utopian ideal, right? If you go back to somewhere that is still okay, it's still back when things were good, and you can start over again, and you start on that good foundation and move forward, there's an appeal there. It's perhaps not realistic, but there is a clear appeal to do that, and that's what drives a lot of people. And Vermont in particular, and we see this to some extent in New Hampshire and Maine as well, has that appeal. There's something about that simple New England lifestyle, that rural beauty, that draws people in that way, that they feel like they can do it better this time. So I keep talking about some other communities, but again, as I said, most people were not living on communes, so each community I give you an example of is going to have sort of many extra people who were maybe visited the communes or followed some of these same principles but lived on their own farm. So this is the Redbird community, which is a radical lesbian collective in Huntington, Vermont. These women lived off this land in Huntington and hired themselves as carpenters and women of all jobs around the Burlington area. Huntington's just a little south of Burlington. And in the winters, they lived collectively in a house in Burlington. They did a lot of work with women's health and community health in Burlington. They were instrumental in founding a People's Free Health Clinic, as well as setting up some of the first resources for domestic violence survivors, and helped a lot of women get out of bad situations. They were actually started by when a number of women formed to raise money as a legal aid fund for women who had come out as lesbians and were being sued by their husbands to take away their children. So they started as a legal aid fund to help those women keep their children. They continued to organize. They gained some national recognition for supporting cases across the United States, and a number of them moved together to Redbird. This is a community called Mullen Hill in the northeast of Vermont. This is a primarily, but not exclusively, agricultural community, where they were really trying to sort of to break up what had existed as traditional family structures. If you want to read a really good sort of overview of Back to the Land and communal living in Vermont, Kate, who I'm pretty sure is the baby right there, just wrote a really good book, Kate Delaz, called We Are as Gods. It's a phenomenal read. We worked with Kate throughout this project. She's an extraordinary writer, and she reflects on, she calls it Mulberry Hill in the book, but reflects on the sort of founding and then disintegration of this community. But you can see a lot of the things that are going to be common in other communes, the idea of chosen family, this group of people who all come together with shared purpose and shared goals, geodesic domes, which are huge in the 70s. They built one there, and then Kate grew up in a different one that she talks about in her book. This is Frog Run Farm, which is in east, sort of, again, in the northeast. A lot of these people go into what we call the Northeast Kingdom in Vermont, that sort of northeast corner, which is a very rural, sparsely populated, where the land is inexpensive. This is Frog Run Farm. They were a very intensively agricultural farm. They were very dedicated to back to the land practices, to farming with horses. They did the most extraordinary things. Frog Run is no longer still there. A lot of the people involved in it are still around, including this gentleman here. This is a man named Robert Hourier. Robert Hourier, in the early 1970s, traveled around the country to try to get to some understanding of the very first stirrings of this communal movement. And he wrote a book called Getting Back Together. And I believe it was published in 1971. And then came back, and with his wife, Mary, who is, I can't figure out, but she's in that picture. They founded Frog Run Farm. Robert Hourier went on to become one of the founders of NOFA, the Northeast Organic Farming Association. But was very interested, he had been a journalist before they came up to Vermont. He was very interested in sort of understanding the societal impulses that were driving this, and understanding like how you change the system. As I mentioned before, that optimism and sense of remaking society. So that's him with his daughter. This is the Wooden Shoe community. Every community had different ways of living. The Wooden Shoe was small, very much agricultural. They sort of hopscotched the border back and forth between New Hampshire and Vermont. Jake is right there. Jake spoke at one of our early conferences, and he said, I can sit through anything now, because every Friday they had meetings, and they would hours and hours and hours. They would sit until they had figured out everything for that week. They would talk everything through, just endlessly. And he says, literally, I can sit back and just zone out for anything now. So this is a small, intensively agricultural community. They gave us these amazing pictures of barn raisings and crops and things like that. And Jake and his wife Liz now run a small organic farm in Norwich, Vermont. Today, they work very closely with King Arthur Flour, actually, which is right in that area as well. John and Lisa Freitag, who are in this image, and that's their son there. John Freitag was a conscientious objector in the Vietnam War, and as his service, instead of serving in the military, his nonprofit service was that he became an early organizer for NOFA. He did a lot of legwork in going from farm to farm, people who were doing this early experimentation with organic farming, saying, we can build you a support network. We can start to collect this food and start to find distribution pathways for this food, and we can make a market for it and work on that market for it. So he did that. Lisa became very involved in women's health, particularly in home birth, and new health therapies was very much, alternative health was very much a theme as well. And I want to mention something too, that none of this is happening in a vacuum, obviously. This back to the land, the sense of greater agricultural and lifestyle understanding. And pretty much everyone we talked to who lived on a community or just had their own farm or was getting involved in agriculture specifically, but really any kind of sawing your own wood, raising animals, building your own house with post and beam timbers and things like that, has a story about how they were maybe out in their yard or trying to calm a horse down or about to run a log through the sawmill of a Vermonter who came up and was just like, don't do that. you are doing it wrong. You're going to get yourself killed. Or came up and looked around and said, you do not have nearly enough wood to get through the winter. Or I heard you were looking for a cider mill or a cider press. I've got the old one. A lot of these people connected with the previous generation of farmers, of artisans, of crafters, who had a really deep understanding of how to do things by hand, how to do things without electricity, how to do things without pesticides and modern chemicals, how to understand herbalism and things like that. And this is the generation, not necessarily the parents' generation, but the grandparents' generation, so roughly the Nearings generation, that the world had sort of moved past to a certain extent, that the technology improvements of the 20th century, maybe their grandkids were no longer interested in farming. They had grown up in Vermont, they wanted to get off the farm. As part of these migrations of the baby boomers, they were leaving Vermont at the same time these young people were coming in. And there were these really extraordinary connections made. Someone said to us as we were doing this project, California was where you went if you wanted to drop out. If you wanted nothing to do with anything anymore, you went to California. But Vermont was where you went if you wanted to connect, and you wanted to be part of a community. And that's what we really found, is that the people who were committed to this, who connected with these Vermonters and these people who lived here, really, they were the people who stayed. They found a lifestyle and they made a life that drew them and that appealed to them. And in here, he's lighting a pipe. You can't see it very well. This gentleman, he was connected to Frog Run Farm there. So he was their guy down the road who I'm sad that I forget his name, unfortunately, but he was an old Vermonter that was connected to Frog Run that they remembered very fondly. In particular, I believe he told them a lot about working with the horses because they were very committed to doing their fields with horses. But we have a lot of these photographs of these people that they all remember fondly as having. He's lighting a pipe in, that's his kitchen. They visited him. A lot of communities were loosely organized under Free Vermont, which is a philosophy both of freeing yourself from societal constraints, but also things should be free. There was a free health clinic in Burlington. There was a free garage in Brattleboro, in the southern end of the state. There was a sense that we should be providing for people in society and also getting rid of things. Out of the Free Vermont movement came an organized group of people who created this home health handbook to start to disseminate among communities. You might not have someone who knew a whole lot about medicine in your community. It was, generally a ragtag group of people who were learning as they went along. So this was distributed in part to recognize what home remedies there might be in terms of herbalism, but also when you should really go to the doctor and not eschew society anymore. So this was created and written by a group of people connected to the community. Some of them were doctors. And then we'll talk about so what comes out of the 70s. So early part of the 70s, people are founding communities. This is maybe the first 5 years of the 70s. There's a big push for founding communes, for people moving to Vermont, for people starting farms or living in more urban areas but getting involved in these same kinds of drives. By the latter half of the 70s, people who are going to stay are staying. There definitely was a big push of people who arrived and just did not stay. They just couldn't cope with the first winter. They realized this was just not for them. So the people who stayed in Vermont are going to start to really become part of the community. And this is a group of people we found who are highly educated. They're extremely well read, and there's a reason they're getting inspired by reading books like Living the Good Life and reading the Mother Earth News. They are almost exclusively people who have a four-year college degree. Quite a few of them also have graduate work or even doctorates. They are, by and large, generally well off. community. There may be some family money, or they may have worked for a few years with that college education before coming to Vermont. And there are a group of people who, perhaps because of political organizing experience in college, they're extremely apt at using the system, even as they might reject parts of it. They understand how to organize people. They understand how to organize around a cause, how to set up systems. And organizations like NOFA, this is the very first, and still the sigil for NOFA, it was just the symbol for NOFA, it was designed by Roger, and I'm forgetting his last name, I'm so sorry. But it was at the time the Natural Organic Farmers Association. So this was put together to link up and market these organic farmers. All these people who are doing experiments in isolation now are going to start to link together for distribution networks and to get products to market and to create that market, to start to get to people to understand what organic agriculture is and why it might be preferable. This is an early food distribution through the Plainfield Co-op, Plainfield, Vermont. And then this is the earliest of the attempts at a food co-op storefront at a farmer's market. This is a Plainfield Co-op again. So agricultural systems and the idea of food co-ops and of creating markets for organic products is going to be one of the early pushes. Another thing that comes out of this is anti-nuclear protests and anti-nuclear organizing. By this time, the nuclear power plant in Vermont Yankee, was already constructed. It was on its way, but people by the mid-'70s were organizing around prevention of the Seabrook nuclear power plant in New Hampshire. They were protesting. This is the State House in Montpelier. So people are protesting on a lawn there. And this is a group of young people from Middlebury College who have gone down to Seabrook. And the sort of activism movements of the latter part of the 1970s and continuing on into the 80s and even today are going to be driven by a lot of the same organizing principles that animated the anti-Vietnam protests. So these young people were organized at Middlebury College. They attended sort of essentially classes on nonviolent protest. Here's what it's like to be arrested. Here's how you should not react. Things like that. And then they were organized together and driven down to Seabrook altogether, which is a model that continues today for protest movements. In particular, people were just doing this in Montpelier not that long ago for the climate marches in New York City. Same exact model as these people were using in the 1970s, because they're very smart about the way they're bringing people together. The gay rights movement also starts to learn these same lessons and start to take root in Vermont. In particular, these are women from the Redbird community again, marching in one of the earliest pride parades in Burlington, Vermont. And this is very much, by the late part of the 1970s into the early 1980s, this is very much going to be the seeds of a movement in Vermont that's going to result in Vermont being the first state in the country to have civil unions, and then the first state where the legislature decides on gay marriage. Including so a number of people who are involved in the very earliest seeds of this movement, who were somewhat involved in counterculture, are going to go on to become elected to the legislature and really hold positions of political power and authority that are going to allow them to take this, that concept of gay rights forward. The Gay Person's Guide to New England. It's modeled after the travel books created for African Americans to know what places were safe, what places were welcoming. It's a very deliberate mirror. Other animating social activism of the 1970s, this is a march pro and against on the anniversary of Roe v. Wade. A lot of the people forming health clinics in Burlington were very involved in pro-choice movements. This is an interesting, continuing largely out of that anti-nuclear movement, this is a push for alternative energy. Windmills and solar power are very much strong interests throughout the 1970s. There are tons of, as I mentioned, Garden Way Publishing, and tons of people have how you're really going to live sustainably. This is where the concept of off the grid starts to take hold. This gentleman here has founded a computer company in Vermont today, but he got his start driving out to the Midwest, buying these windmills, bringing them back to Vermont, refurbishing them, and then this is, it's a typical old Vermont farm couple that now has a windmill for electricity in their own backyard, and this is where solar is going to get its first big push in Vermont today. The company he founded actually still does wind power in Vermont today. But the idea of exploring alternative forms of energy for sustainability is very much a push of the late 1970s and going on forward, largely in response to the anti-nuclear movement. Arts and crafts are also, this is a tough photograph. It's even blurry when you see it in person, I apologize. But arts and crafts and the idea of supporting artistic lifestyles is going to be a big push out of the 1970s as well. This is a group called the Brook Farm community. They're again up in the northeastern part of Vermont. This is a really interesting community. They're split between sort of artisans, crafters, and artists. The artisans are making these tooled leather bags for sale, and this is how they supported their farm. They had a big, huge, beautiful tract of land. You can stand on a hill and see Canada. It's just a gorgeous, gorgeous spot. And they are still an active community. They hold the land in trust together now. A lot of them have small houses around there. They invited us up and spoke to us for 4 hours about the founding in the early days of Brook. They made us a potluck. It was amazing. So this is an example of their tooled leather bag that's now in our collections. And that's the sales things that they were doing. They a very deliberate, canny sense of artisanship, but also, like the organic markets opening up, finding markets for their work. The other side of life at Brook community was dancers. It's really extraordinary modern dancers who would practice and spend time in sort of retreat in their community, and then would go down to New York City and choreograph and do modern dance and become quite famous in modern dance circles for doing that. Steve Paxton is one of their lead people. But this idea of fusing an artistic life with a practical, with a simple and a self-sustaining one is very much a feature of some of these communities. It says COFEC, the co-op, electric co-ops in Vermont get a big boost at this time. And among the ways in which people start to become part of the civic life of their community is that they get elected to boards on nonprofits and boards of local electric co-ops. And Goddard College, which is a small liberal arts college in Plainfield, Vermont. Someone said to us in one of our early community forums, they said, I saw this map, I remember it distinctly. It was a big map of the United States, and it was Berkeley, California, New York City, Plainfield, Vermont. Places to go for living the life. Plainfield, Vermont, because of Goddard College. This degree that gets founded at Goddard College in the 1970s, I think sort of sums it up. Alternative technologies, no-growth economy, organic agriculture, urban decentralization, politics of ecology, design and construction of experimental models for wind, solar, and methane-powered energy. All that in one degree that you can do at Goddard. The Institute for Social Ecology actually still exists. It's still a degree-granting program at Goddard College. Yeah?
Do you know Brian College?
I don't know him. Is he there now?
Yeah.
Yeah.
He was in the Cultural Alliance when I was interviewed.
Mm-hmm.
And he is now one of the primary sources of information on GMOs.
Oh, brilliant. And he's still with Goddard? Yes. Yep, there are some of these people are definitely still there. I don't see him up there, but it's a great program. Still at Goddard today. So this is Goddard College campus in the 1970s. Using stone, wind power, little farm, pretty typical. So, so we spent 2 years doing this. We did oral histories. We said we would do 50. We did 66. We collected objects. We collected papers. These photographs that you see here. Our goal was not to provide a definitive what the heck happened in the 70s and how did it influence Vermont. It was to provide, as we do as an historical society, to provide an archive and a collection to get a sort of initial picture of it, and then to provide a place where people can come and research and then build on that and keep understanding as we move forward in Vermont history. So to cap the project, we did an exhibition. This is the bus that sat on our front lawn until not too long ago. I had to go home for the winter, unfortunately. And then we created this exhibition in our space and Yeah, there it is. That's the first edition. I think it's the first edition of Living a Good Life in the front case there. With this is sort of the, as you come in the entrance case, the inspirations for it. Those are all in our collection. We already have Living a Good Life in our collection, but some of the others we collected. This is Getting Back Together, which is the book that I mentioned Robert Hourier wrote. We also did a symposium at which a number of people speak. We give an award every year for the best presentation of Vermont history, whether it's a book, a documentary, a website, or what have you. This particular year, we gave it to the documentary called State of Marriage, which was about the civil union fight in Vermont, and it was accepted by Representative Bill Lippert, who got a start as a counterculture activist in the 1970s and became one of the earliest openly gay members of the Vermont legislature. And he stood up at this. He said, I literally never thought I'd be accepting an award at the Vermont Historical Society as part of a day talking about the 1970s. That documentary is on Netflix, by the way. It's excellent if you're interested. State of Marriage, streaming on Netflix. So we did this whole symposium in which we sort of did an initial, put it into context both with scholars and with the people we had interviewed. Sort of what's the scholarly view, what's the lived experience of what it was like to be here. And I'll finish with this, which is that about 3 months after we started this project, Senator Sanders announced he was running for president, and every news organization in the country called us and said, tell us about everything, like what and why and how, and we really didn't have anything for them yet, A, because Sanders' life is an open book, and B, because we were so early in the project. I think in the public eye today, Bernie Sanders is sort of the summary of how Vermont changed in the 1970s. The ways in which the values of that counterculture generation, that counterculture movement shaped the way the state moved going forward and shaped really the way a national conversation around back to the land and sustainability moved forward. But so our, as I mentioned, Jackie...
The fear of being invaded by 50,000 hippies came true.
You know, not 50,000 worth, but it kind of did, in that they did change the state. They sort of defined the direction in which the state went going forward, and now it's a place known for food, for political activism, for being a socially and politically liberal place. It does somewhat still struggle with that legacy, and that it is a very divided state in some ways. There is still absolutely a deeply rural part of Vermont that is still a very conservative strata of society as well. So it's created sort of an interesting societal tension in that sense. But to a lot of people looking from the outside in, Sanders is sort of the epitome of what comes out. He came to Vermont in the 1960s. Never really lived on a commune himself, but had some land, in which he did some back to the land things. Knew a lot of the people in the slides that I've shown you as a journalist and as an early writer and things like that. He spent most of the 1970s running for political office as part of the Liberty Union Party and did not achieve any kind of success in politics until this election, 1981, mayor of Burlington, Vermont. However, what I'm going to say is, so this is the outside looking in perspective on the summation of the 70s. Jackie, who I mentioned, was our curator, who was the lead on this project, but has since retired. Her alternative way of summing up the 1970s is the bread and puppet theater. And that the argument is that Peter and Elke Schumann, and for those of you who don't know, Elke is actually Scott Nearing's granddaughter. Peter and Elke Schumann, founding the Bread and Puppet Theater, were invited to Goddard College as artists in residence in the early 1970s and then moved to Glover, Vermont, where they still are today. That their combination of artistry, of political activism, of sort of continuing to live that simple, straightforward life, that their fusion of all of those things is actually probably the best way to sum up the 1970s. In Vermont, and that they sort of continue to be the epitome of that lifestyle and those ideas that continue forward in Vermont today. So that is the end of my talk. So That was a lot. So I went to college in Vermont, and I work for the Vermont Historical Society, and we do a little bit of everything. So one of the cool parts of my job is that one week I'm doing this, and the next week I do a little bit of everything on the history of Vermont. Right now we're researching for our next major exhibition is going to be the history of automobile racing in Vermont. So quite a bit different from this talk. This project really was Jackie's passion project. That she worked on slowly. She was a graduate student in the 1970s in Vermont. So when we would go out on the road together, I'd say, I didn't exist in the 1970s. And
Yeah.
she was living this in the 1970s. So it was an interesting way for both of us to understand this project as we worked together on it. But it was she as curator drove the project, and I worked alongside it on her now that she's retired. I've taken over finishing out the exhibition and continuing the research and speaking about it.
We're probably the foremost authority on counterculture in Vermont.
Maybe. Yeah, Jackie lived with it for longer than...
The people that
Yeah, the people that lived it, and Jackie lived with it for longer than I did, so she's just actually written a big, nice overview article. We do a scholarly publication on Vermont history, so she's written a big overview article that's going to be published in our fall issue of Vermont History. If you're interested in the Maine variation on this, Kate McBrien, who is your state curator at the Maine Historical Society, who's phenomenal, has also done research on counterculture in Maine, and I believe she wrote an article as well, documenting it. It wasn't, Vermont really, it's like Vermont and California and parts of the Southwest and the Northwest really took the cake for counterculture in New England anyway. But there were instances of similar veins and similar lines of thought here in Maine. So if you want to learn more about that, Kate is now at the Maine Historical Society. I believe she was at the Maine State Museum when she did that research. But call her. She's nice. She's good people, if you're curious. So, yeah.
So I'd be curious, the people that you spoke to who lived through this,
Mm-hmm.
who went back to the land and went back to Vermont and had this concept of trying to change society, what are their feelings now?
Yeah.
What happened, what didn't happen, and maybe the why?
That's a really good question. So this was one of the things we sort of tangled with at the symposium to a certain extent. And the question was, do you feel like you failed? You know, because as young people, yeah. So so that was the question. But I mean, that's an extreme way of putting it. But you know, you wanted to change the whole world from top to bottom, and obviously that didn't happen. And I think a lot of them said, no. You know, look at all of the things we did accomplish. You know, no one completely changes everything, but all the ways in which women's rights were moved forward, in which our sort of conceptions of the tremendous diversity of ways to live a life has become mainstream, especially in Vermont, but really it's going nationally. The idea that the promulgation of small-scale agriculture, of locavore eating, of all of this new ways of understanding food and food systems like that are moving forward. We did a program in March. I moderated a panel on women in the counterculture, and we had these like absolutely extraordinary women talking about sort of what was it like to be a woman in these communities, and you know, you were trying to break out of gender roles, but did you really? Did you just end up doing the dishes anyway? Which unfortunately was yes a lot of the times. But one of them on that panel said, yeah, it feels like we're starting over again right now. But at the same time, she said, I see the whole generation that came after us that takes all this for granted that's angry now. And she says, I recognize a lot of the same energy and passion. She said, and that's inspiring. You know, we had to start from scratch. But that a lot of the young people, in particular in that room, for her, that was where she drew her lessons and moved forward. So that was, I thought, a really nice way of encapsulating it. It is tricky though, because some of these people are so young when this starts, and that idea of creating a new America in Vermont, that's a tall order.
And a lot of them are still alive and still working at it.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
So did you get a sense, I mean, as we were talking about the different generations, a lot of times, you know, there were kids there, and they were growing up, and parents that knew the values were raising those kids, and then those kids grew up and had kids, and so you've got those values, you know, kind of blossoming, and yet sometimes they didn't turn out quite what we thought they were going to turn out.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, they're taking it for granted. Well,
Yeah.
we raised them that way. In some ways, we didn't know it was going to happen that way, but now we've got, I mean, did you get a sense of that in talking to different people in different generations and how that evolved?
Yeah, so I think that the children of, you know, those pictures you saw, the young kids on in the communes or growing up on these farms, that's a really interesting, someone should really do like a whole study on that alone. We touched on it with this project, but I think there's a lot more to be mined. Some kids just totally were having none of it. You know, they left. They live in the big city now. You know, they're appreciative for what their parents did, but others not so much. Some of them are just doing it their own way. One of the kids who grew up on a farm in southern Vermont called Packers Corners is now a major union organizer in New York City. Another is an architect who sort of specializes in design build and post and beam and sort of energy efficient construction. One of, I think, the best perspectives on that came from Maria Schumann, actually, Peter and Alco's daughter, who spoke at one of our forums. She said, I lived this sort of two-part life, which in the summers she was on the farm in Glover. She was meeting these extraordinary artists from around the world, or she was traveling with the Bread and Puppet group. You know, she was allowed this like freedom and independence, and she had this charmed life. And in the fall, she had to go to Glover Public Schools with farm kids from the local Vermont community who were really nervous about all the weird stuff that was going on up at the Bread and Puppet farm. And she said, remember, I used to bring my father's bread because part of the thing of Bread and Puppet is that Peter bakes this bread and you're served the bread. She said, I'd bring that to school and kids would make fun of me for it. And a lot of the parents said, yeah, we used to pack our kids' lunch with like brown rice and granola and tofu and all these things that we were eating at home, and they would trade it for Wonder Bread and Twinkies when they got to school. You know, kids are kids when you're that young. You want to fit in, and some of them absolutely. And Maria's an artist now. Some of them absolutely grew up to continue in that. Some of them rejected it totally. There's a lot more that needs to be done. I don't have a good definitive answer on that.
Good documentaries about the farm in Tennessee.
Mm-hmm.
And there are some documentaries that interview the kids of the farm, or kids that left and then came back to the farm. Those are on Netflix also. This is an interesting study.
Yeah. Yeah.
For reference, when did the Nearings move from Vermont to Albuquerque?
In the early 50s, 52, I believe.
Yeah, they were long gone by the.
And the book, Living a Good Life, was about Vermont, but it didn't come out until they moved to Maine.
Yep.
I just want to say that I walked into this, I didn't know where I was coming tonight, and I was here in 1970 and visited the Nearings, and I didn't know that this was where I was going to be tonight. Oh, this is a place.
Serendipity.
Really cool.
Nice.
Great.
Nice.
Thank you so much, man.
Yeah. You're so welcome.